As we continue our way to Halloween Ends, it's time to move on to the next movie in the franchise, which is the direct sequel to the 1978 Halloween, 1981's Halloween 2. This is a pretty decent sequel, and I like that it picks up immediately after the events of the first movie and even recapping the final 5 minutes or so. So let's get right into it and start with the review of 1981's Halloween 2. If you haven't seen Halloween 2, please be aware that this video will be containing spoilers. So, as I said, this movie picks up right where the original left off. It's still Halloween night, 1978, and we do get a brief recap of the end of the first movie. They made a strange edit here where there's a scene where Michael and Laurie have a struggle in the hallway as Loomis is coming into the house and Laurie pulls off Michael's mask. In the original movie, they show Michael's face pretty clearly. In the recap here, they kind of edit it so that his face isn't shown as clearly. Not really sure why they chose to do that. So as things advance past this point, we get to Loomis shooting Michael a total of 6 times, a fact of which he reminds us many times later, and Michael falls off the balcony, but is moments later gone from the ground below. Dr. Loomis goes out to check and see what's going on, and sees that Michael has left some blood behind, showing that he has wounds from the shots, but it was not enough to keep him down for any amount of time, and he's already up and gone. A neighbor comes out to see what's going on, and Loomis tells him to call the police immediately, and this is how we start the second movie. So to really get the second movie started, there's a lot of things that happen to get things in place and set the scene. First, Dr. Loomis knows that Michael's still out there, he's still a threat, he's still dangerous, so he goes with the Haddonfield police and immediately begins a search for him. Laurie Strode is taken to Haddonfield Memorial Hospital to get her wounds treated, and she's very nervous about the prospect of being put to sleep because she's panicked and scared, and who could blame her with what she's been through, but the doctors do give her a sedative to help her relax. Michael immediately goes on search for a new weapon. We see him wandering around behind some houses. He goes into a house of an older couple, steals a new butcher knife, but does not choose to attack them at all, just leaves. But he does immediately go next door and kill their neighbor, who's a teenage girl, so maybe that's his target that he's mainly after. As Dr. Loomis and the police are searching for Michael, they spot someone who they think is him. They see someone wearing a very similar Halloween mask, although it might have blonder hair, and a similar outfit. They confront them and they begin to walk away at a quick pace and walk out into the street. Dr. Loomis tries to take a shot. The sheriff stops him, and the other person is immediately hit by another police cruiser coming quickly down the road and pinned between that car and a van, which erupts into flames, engulfing and killing this person. So they think this may be Michael who is just killed, although they're not sure. I think this is a very interesting part here because by having someone else wear the same mask, that shows that this is a massacre in the area, and Michael didn't grab the only one of its kind. So that makes sense. There would be more than one. As Michael's making his way around town, he crosses paths with a boy who's walking around with a radio, and the radio is broadcasting the news, and it says that there is a survivor of the attacks that happened tonight, Laurie Strode, and that she's been taken to Haddonfield Memorial Hospital. So this tells Michael where she is, and he immediately starts to head to the hospital. This is where he goes next. We see him arrive immediately following one of the nurses' arrival, and he immediately goes to work. There's a lot to be said about this hospital. This hospital is very slow, it's very lowly staffed, and it is just quiet. More quiet than I've ever seen any hospital. Now, I don't know if this is more common for a small town hospital compared to a busier area, but this hospital has next to nobody in it. There appears to be very few patients. There's only one doctor on call at night and limited numbers of nurses. So Michael kind of comes in and quickly kind of has the run of the place. This just doesn't seem like it would be possible in a normal hospital. Again, I don't know if this is also more normal for the time period, 1978 versus now. I'm just always amazed when I watch this movie because you just couldn't be walking unnoticed around a hospital at any time of day, and at no time of day is a hospital quiet and empty, really. Michael wastes no time finding his way into the hospital, walking right past the security cameras of a less than attentive security guard, and he finds a way to disable the phone lines. This is noticed by one of the nurses when they're trying to reach Lori's parents to let them know that she's there. The security guard goes to try to find the source of the phone outage, and this is when he notices that the door to the storeroom is open, and he goes in to see if he can find who's in there. He's trying to radio back to one of the nurses to call the sheriff's office, but the radio's not working, and as he's going around, he eventually does come across Michael, and Michael kills him with a hammer, so that's the second kill of this movie. We do then see Dr. Loomis with the medical examiner and the body of the person who was burned alive. They say that they believe the person killed was around 17 years old, and Dr. Loomis says, well, Michael is 21, so this might not be him. He says they need a full panel of x-rays and to review their dental records to get a fully positive ID, but Dr. Loomis knows they don't have that kind of time, so they can't wait. They have to keep looking and see if Michael's still out there. They do go to the Myers house where a angry mob has kind of gathered and they're throwing rocks and breaking windows, and this is all because the people are just mad. They know that this person has come back to town and killed some of their friends and neighbors, and so this is how they're reacting. The deputy and Loomis have a conversation about Michael returning after 15 years, and Loomis tells him that at the hospital that Michael was at, he was basically an ideal patient. He didn't fight with the staff, he didn't talk, he didn't really do much of anything. He just sat with impossible patients, waiting for something to trigger him to go back home to do what he did on this night. He says that the staff was not prepared for Michael when things went wrong. He said that they didn't know what he was, although he did know what he was. Another important note here is that the deputy gives Loomis a cigarette and a yellow lighter. Loomis ends up keeping this yellow lighter, and that comes into play later in the movie. Back at the hospital, Laurie has an interesting dream that's perhaps a forgotten memory. We see a young girl, a young Laurie Strode, talking to a woman who we think is her mother, although she tells Laurie she's not her mother. We then see Laurie standing in a room looking at a boy looking out a window. And the boy turns around to look at her, and this we would believe to be Michael, so it's a memory of her having seen Michael at a much younger age. We next have two staff members at the hospital, Bud, the paramedic driver, and Nurse Karen. They decide to have a little bit of fun when they're supposed to be at work, and they go down and get into a hot tub together. Michael turns up the heat on him, and so when it gets a little too hot, Nurse Karen asks Bud to go check on it. He does, and Michael takes him out next by strangling him, then goes in and takes out Nurse Karen. He does this by drowning her. Back with Dr. Loomis and the Haddonfield police, they're at a school that it appears that Michael has broken into. He came in through a window. It looks like he stabbed the sister in a child's drawing, and he wrote the word Sam Hain in blood on the blackboard. And Dr. Loomis reveals that this refers to the Lord of the Dead, and it's an old festival to celebrate the end of summer and beginning of fall on October 31st. Nurse Chambers arrives in this scene and informs Dr. Loomis that he's been ordered back to Smith's Grove by order of the governor because they want to keep this all in under wraps, basically. He tells her that he can't go, he needs to stay, but she says it's not really his choice, that they've sent a marshal to escort him back. Back at the hospital, things start to kick into a bit of high gear. Jimmy, one of the EMTs, goes to check on Lori and talk to her and say that he's going to protect her if anything happens tonight, and he notices that she's non-responsive. He gets the nurses involved, and one of the nurses, Nurse Janet, goes looking for Dr. Mixter, the doctor on call. When she finds him in his office, she finds that he's dead. He's sitting there staring at a fish tank, and he has a syringe sticking out of his eye. Michael's still in the room, and he kills Nurse Janet next by injecting her with air from a syringe to her head. The EMT and Nurse Jill are still waiting by with Lori, but they're not sure what to do, so they go looking for more help. Michael then takes the opportunity to go into Laurie's room and attempts to stab her, but she's already gone. She is begun wandering the halls kind of in a daze, and she wanders into a room and sits with the phone against the wall. Michael begins wandering the halls looking for Laurie as Jimmy and Nurse Jill are looking for more help. Jimmy finds the head nurse, Mrs. Alves, in the surgery room. She's already dead. She has a head wound and she has an IV in her arm and is dripping blood out onto the floor. As he goes to leave, he slips on the blood and falls and knocks himself out. We then see Nurse Jill decide to leave to try to get help, but she goes out to her car and finds that the tires have been flattened. She goes back in and she sees Lori walking through the halls and tries to call out to her, but Michael has walked up behind her and kills her next by stabbing her with a scalpel. Michael then begins a slow-paced pursuit of Laurie. And that's one thing I love about these movies. Michael is a killer. He kills these people very efficiently, but he is in no hurry. He walks at a very slow and steady pace. Clearly, the serial killer believes that slow and steady does indeed win the race, and he has a lot of results to show for it. As they're running, Lori bumps into the body of the security guard in the basement and eventually finds her way back upstairs and runs outside and hides in a car. We see Dr. Loomis and Nurse Chambers with the marshal being led out of town, and the nurse reveals to Dr. Loomis a very important piece of information that a file was unsealed by the governor that revealed that Laurie Strode is indeed Michael Myers' younger sister. And when his parents died, she was adopted by the Strode family, and the fact that she was Michael Myers' sister was locked up. So now Dr. Loomis knows this is why Michael is back. 15 years ago, he killed one sister, and now he's back to kill the other. And so he decides they need to stop this. He knows where Laurie is at the hospital, so he wants to try to go and help. He holds the marshal at gunpoint and threatens him and tells him to drive to the hospital, firing a warning shot. So the marshal does begin to do that. Back at the hospital, we see Laurie hiding in the car. This turns out to be Jimmy's car, and he has come to and come back out and gets in the car and tries to start it up, but he's still suffering from a bit of a head wound, so he eventually passes out onto the horn. Laurie gets out of the car and sees Dr. Loomis, the marshal, and the nurse arrive and go inside, tries to call out for help but can't manage it till they're already inside. As she stands up and begins to go, she sees Michael start coming out from behind one of the outdoor buildings and begins his slow-paced pursuit of her yet again. Luckily slow because she's able to get to the door, bang on it, and Dr. Loomis comes over, unlocks the door, and lets her in. This leads to one of my favorite parts, and that's where Michael just straight up walks through the door to the hospital. He doesn't reach out and break the glass first. He doesn't do anything to try to break the glass. He just simply walks into the door and walks through it, and the door gives way without any trouble. This was a very scary scene to me when I was a kid. I just remember thinking that was pretty scary that he just straight up walked through this glass door. As he does, Dr. Loomis fires 5 more shots. One of them looks like they miss, but he fires 5 shots, and Michael goes down again. The marshal approaches and Loomis warns him that he's still breathing and to stay away. He sends Nurse Chambers out to the car to radio for help. The marshal does indeed get too close and becomes Michael's next victim. He wakes up, grabs the marshal, and cuts his throat with the scalpel, and then begins chasing after Dr. Loomis and Laurie. They lead Michael down a hall and they end up in one of the surgical rooms and Michael pursues them in. Dr. Loomis gives Laurie a second gun that he had and tells her to use it, and even though she doesn't want to, Michael eventually breaks into the room and the doctor tries to shoot him, but the gun doesn't fire. Michael stabs Dr. Loomis, knocking him over. He comes towards Laurie and she calls out to him, giving him a brief pause, but then he does advance. She takes the gun and shoots him twice in both eyes. And Michael seems a little bit panicked here, actually. He starts slashing out with the scalpel wildly and making some noises. He seems concerned. And Dr. Loomis starts opening up some gas canisters of oxygen and other gases to get Michael's attention. This is drawing Michael around the room. He's blind. He's still slashing out wildly, but they open more gas cans, and he tells Lori to get out quickly. She does, and Dr. Loomis pulls out the yellow lighter that he had gotten from Deputy Hunt earlier in the movie, and he tells Michael it's time, and he lights it and ignites the gas, engulfing the entire room in flames, assuming sacrificing himself along with Michael. We see Laurie out in the hallway outside the flaming doorway, and we do see Michael start to emerge, walking out on fire, and he does eventually collapse into a pile of flames. And this is, for all intents and purposes, meant to be the end of Michael Myers. They did not intend to make many more sequels after this. This was supposed to be the end for him. This was supposed to be his death scene, and we're to assume that Dr. Loomis died in the flames as well. The movie ends with Laurie being led out of the hospital the next morning in a wheelchair, and the police note that they've found 10 bodies so far. Laurie's loaded into another ambulance, we assume to go to another hospital, and that is the end of Halloween 2. A few notable points in this movie are that Michael's mask does seem to look a little bit different in this movie, although looking into it, it is the same mask from the original movie. It's just a little worn out and a little discolored from being kept in improper storage for 3 years between the production of the first movie and the production of the second movie. It also at times looks a little different, but that's because it's worn by a different person, so it fits that person differently. Another key difference to this movie is that it has a lot of blood in this movie, which the first movie didn't. But I like that about the first movie. I like that the first movie wasn't super bloody and gory and didn't need to be in order to be scary. But that is another thing that helps this movie stand apart from the first movie. Another key thing this movie does is establish Laurie Strode as Michael's sister. The main thing this does is gives Michael purpose. We know that he killed his first sister at the age of 6, and now he's 21 and he's come back and he's coming to kill another sister, trying to finish the job he started 15 years ago. The first movie, it seemed Michael's killing was kind of at random. He just broke out, was back in town, and targeted Lori because he saw her along with some of her friends. Now we know this wasn't coincidence, this was his intent to go after her specifically. Michael does have a higher kill count in this movie. He kills 9 people up from 5 in the previous movie. First, he kills by stabbing the teenage girl in a house near the Doyle house. The second kill is Mr. Garrett, the security guard, with a hammer. The third kill is Bud, the paramedic driver, by strangling him. The fourth kill is Nurse Karen by drowning. The fifth kill is Dr. Mixter with a syringe to the eye. And the sixth kill is Nurse Janet with a syringe full of air injected into her head. The seventh kill was Mrs. Alves with there's a head wound, and she has an IV in her arm dripping her blood out. So we're not 100% sure how she died, but we can assume it's from these wounds. The eighth kill was Nurse Jill being stabbed with a scalpel, and the ninth kill was the marshal who was trying to take Dr. Loomis out of town, and he's killed by getting his throat cut by Michael with a scalpel. And then there are other deaths in the movie not attributed to Michael, of course. The kid in the similar Halloween costume to Michael was hit by a sheriff's deputy car and then burned alive. Dr. Loomis was killed by his own sacrifice, and Michael himself was killed by Dr. Loomis. Sequels are very rarely ever as good as the original movie. That's the case most of the time. This one I feel like was a pretty good sequel and followed up from the original movie pretty well. Critics did not agree on Rotten Tomatoes. This movie got a critic score of only 30%, giving it a rotten score. It did get a 63% score from audience members. Over on IMDb, it got a 6.5 out of 10. As I said, I think this is a pretty solid sequel. I think parts 1 and 2 go well together as a movie and its immediate sequel. They work well together, the information follows up together, and the second movie builds upon the information we were given in the first. My personal score for this movie is a 7.5 out of 10. I hope you enjoyed this review of Halloween 2. The next movie in the franchise I'll be reviewing is Halloween 3, so keep an eye out for that video coming soon.